In this video, I'm going to show you guys how to rebuild your KYB SSS forks. And we're going to give you a brief introduction into what revalving is and how to revalve your forks. Check it out.
Before you get started, let's talk about what you need. You need an oil measurement device. You need a fork seal driver, a fork seal bullet, a 15mm wrench, 17mm socket, that's a fork cap wrench, and an inner fork cap wrench. All right, guys, let's get started. First things first, you need to loosen your fork cap. We're using soft jaws here in our vise, but there are other ways to do this. You can use wood or cardboard or leave it in your bike to loosen it. Once you've got it all the way loose, flip the fork upside down and drain it in a suitable container. Underneath this goes into a bucket for us. After it's drained thoroughly, which takes a little while, we clamp our fork down at the lower lug using our soft jaws. We then take our 17mm socket and we loosen the base nut all the way. This can take a little bit of force at the first time. We use a 6-point socket. I highly suggest you do too. Now, thread your fork back into the cap a couple threads so you can flip the fork upside down, and pushing on the lug using another tool we forgot to mention earlier, which is a cartridge rod holding tool, which you can make yourself. We push it in there and hold the rod out. Now you take your 15mm and your 17mm socket and loosen the base nut from the jam nut. Remove the base nut and remove your rebound damping rod. It's a little rod that goes inside your fork. There's the rod. There's the base nut. Take the fork back out, push hard and pull quickly, and now you can pull your inner cartridge out from your fork tubes. On this fork, we're also going to be doing a different spring change for this customer. So we're removing the spring here, and you should do this too so you can thoroughly clean your fork. Next up, we got to get our seals out. Using a very thin screwdriver, you must carefully insert it between the dust seal and your fork and pry out to remove the dust seal. Inside of the fork is a small retaining ring. There are little lips that you can get your screwdriver on and very carefully, without scratching your tube, pop it out. Then, using your fork tube like a slide hammer, smack the fork up with good force up against the top a couple times. It should come off very easily. If not, you may need to apply a little bit of heat on the outer tube. We are now removing the bushings, the seals, the seal retaining ring, and the dust seal. We're keeping the parts that we need to reuse, which is the little aluminum ring you see there and the seal retaining ring. And in this particular fork, we did it. We're doing some testing. So we also have bushings that we'll be keeping. And those are still in excellent condition. They have very low hours on it. Next thing you need to do is remove the inner fork cap, which is the base valve assembly from your cartridge. In order to do this, you need both tools. You will hold the outer fork cap and then use your inner tool and loosen it. Once you've loosened it all the way, push the fork rod all the way in to push the base valve assembly up and out, and then with a little bit of force and a little bit of effort and wiggling, you're able to remove the base valve. We let this drain in our sink for a little while, and we also drain the fork by turning it upside down and stroking the cartridge rod a few times and then letting it drain.
Next up, we need to remove the jam nut. We clamp our shaft and our soft jaws very carefully. This doesn't usually require very much force. We take our 15 and we loosen it up. In this case, it came right off. Next up, we have a couple ways to do this. For you guys at home, we're going to show you a method that works really well. So first things first, clean off your rod and your damping rod and the threads a little bit. Next thing you need to do, and this applies specifically to the KYB, some of the other forks, there are other methods to take this apart, but we take some painter's tape and we wrap it around the threads a few times. 1 or 2 revolutions at most to cover all of the threads is all you need. You don't want it to be too thick. Then you can push the cartridge rod through the cartridge assembly. As you can see here, it came right out. This is to protect the seal that's inside your cartridge assembly. Now you can see our valving assembly. This is called the mid valve. You see that peen on there? You can't get that nut off without destroying that stem. You must grind it as shown here. The same applies to our base valve assembly. Don't try to pull that nut off, you'll destroy it. Be sure you grind off the peen. Some forks require a different method, but on the KYB, you can grind them. Next up is our seals. We've already cleaned our fork tubes. There are different ways to do that. We'll leave that up to you. Now, we've got our new SKF seals. These are their new dual density type. We're gonna use some assembly lube. This is a grease that's oil soluble. We lube everything so it goes on nice and smooth. Make sure you put it on the correct direction. If you paid attention when you pulled it apart, this should become obvious to you. Carefully slide the dust seal on. Then don't forget your seal retaining clip. You don't have to put it on now, but now's the best time. Lubing up the seal so that everything goes together nice and smooth. Putting it on the correct direction. Make sure you paid attention when you pulled it apart. Carefully put this on because there's still a lip on the holes there. Slide it over that smoothly and then you're good to go. Remove the seal bullet and then you can install this little part here. It's very important you put it on the correct direction. Next up is our bushings. We have our outer bushing and our inner bushing. Outer bushing first. It's the bigger one that slides freely on the tube. Then your inner bushing. This fits over the fork into the little groove. Make sure that it's a nice, snug fit. Then you can take your outer tube, slide it on. Next up, you need your seal driver. First things first, we got to beat in the bushings. Using the little metal ring above the seal driver, put your seal driver in and use liberal force here. You'll hear a difference in the proper sound. Next up, we got to do our seal. I like to push the seal in as far as I can before I smack on it. When you hear the tone change, you know you did it right. Now we can put our seal retaining clip back in. I like to squeeze with 2 fingers and pinch it in place, and then I use a screwdriver to make sure that I thoroughly get it in place. Be careful here. You got to get this in right. Lastly, we need to do our dust seal. There are 2 ways to do this. You can use your fork seal driver, or as I like to do it, we just smack it down against the bottom.
All right, now we're gonna put our new fork spring in. We always like to compare our new spring with our old spring. Wouldn't be uncommon for you to get the wrong spring or just have misordered the wrong part. Always check your lengths. The amount of preload you have in your fork spring is critical to fork performance. This is something we can touch on in a later video. We're gonna put this spring in the fork tube in the assembly and set that aside so we can move on to the valving. All right, next up is our base valve. We can go ahead and teach you a little bit about valving. So using a 10 millimeter and our inner cap fork wrench, remove the nut. Be careful, these parts are easy to drop. You don't want to lose them. As you can see, I dropped one here. Lay these out in the order that you take them off. I always like to put what faces down, facing down on the paper. This keeps it easy so you don't have to remember anything. Next up, let's go ahead and remove our parts. That was the rebound check plate. Next up is the valving piston. Just a side note, this piston really isn't what determines your valving, but people call it a valving piston. That's the base valve right there. Now our shim stack. Shim stack is what controls all of your damping characteristics, but there are 2 shim stacks that control compression. This happens to be the base valve. Lay these shims out one by one. Be careful not to double stack them. Once you've laid all of these shims out, you can measure them and enter them into some form of a spreadsheet or a piece of paper for your notation purposes. We're laying everything out here, and we're going to show you a little image of it later. As you can see, there are quite a few items. You have to be very careful with this. Now there's your empty base valve. Now let's take a quick look at your base valve valving. On the left's the piston. Left of that is the rebound check valve. In the middle here is your compression valve stack. There are a lot of shims there. These shims control the fluid that the damping rod pushes into your cartridge. On the right is a couple of miscellaneous parts that are not quite valving. Now, this is your compression valving. It goes in that big hole, it comes out the shim stack there, has to open the shim stack. On the rebound side of things, goes in that little hole, opens a shim stack here, and comes out there. All right, now let's pull apart the mid valve. We've got a 19 millimeter on the flat. We're using our 10 millimeter to pull the nut off. Be very careful when you do this. You do not want to drop or misorder these shims, especially if this is the first time you're taking apart a fork and you want to learn about it. If you've already done it before and you have your notes on it, you could dump this on the ground and it would be fine. But on new forks, when you're learning new things, be careful not to do that. You want to remember how everything goes so you can measure it, notate it, and then make changes as needed. We're currently taking off the rebound stack. This is the valving that controls your rebound damping. All right, guys, now pull off the piston. This is the piston that separates compression from rebound. It's really just a check piston. Now's the valving stack. This is where all the damping changes are made on the compression side of your mid valve. This particular shim stack controls more damping than any other aspect of your fork. It is the single biggest thing you can change and make big notable changes. Unique to this KYB fork that came out around 2011 for Kawasaki's and then made its way onto Yamahas and some other bikes is a low-speed valving system that uses shims instead of coil springs to control the low-speed damping character. In addition to this, it determines the ultimate high-end lift. There's the stem post piston, really unique. Let's go ahead and give you an aerial view of these shim stacks. On the left here is our rebound valving stack. Starts from the piston up here at the top and works its way down to the clamp shim at the bottom. In the middle there, those are crossover shims. Some people call that a two-stage stack, but that's very misleading. Here's our compression shim stack, starting from the piston, working our way down again to our clamp shim. In the middle there is a separator shim. It's unique to this design. And then there's our low-speed control stack, very unique to this specific fork. All right, now we need to start assembly. Now, we're not going to touch too heavily on what you need to do to your shim stacks in this video because that's a little bit too complicated for the amount of time we have allotted here. Having said that, assembly is just the opposite of disassembly. Make sure you put everything in the proper order. Take your time. You don't want any grit or lint in there. Put the piston on the correct direction. You got to remember when you take these things off, you have to pay very, very careful attention. We're putting on the rebound shim stack right now. Then goes the backing plate. We're going to put a tiny little dab of red Loctite, and I mean tiny. We're going to put the nut back on and then lightly torque it. There's a specification for this, and it isn't much. Remember, this is an M6x1 thread. It's hardly anything. You need to be very, very careful with it. So get everything snugged up and then move on to the next step. So now we need to put everything back together. We're going to go ahead and put our damping rod back through the cartridge. We still have our tape on there. You need to line this up. It's kind of a pain. You got to get the piston lined up and then you got to get the shaft lined up in the seal. We'd like to take a T-handle, as you can see here, and then we like to push on it and get everything through. If you do everything right, it goes pretty easy. Now we're going to pull the tape off and install our jam nut. We have the flats where the wrench goes on to the right in this picture or down on the fork as it's installed. It's important you do this right. Number 2, you need to thread it all the way on the shaft until it bottoms out. We lightly do this by hand, but it's important that you do that. Now it's time to fill the fork up with fluid. I like to do it this particular way, and I find it to be very successful for me and for all of our builds here at HP. Fill it up to about a quarter into that upper chamber above my hand. Pretty good ways. You can overfill this, no problem, but if you underfill it, you will have problems. Then I stroke the tube to get all the air out. Take your time here, it takes forever. Just back and forth at the bottom. Get all the air out, then you got to spend a little bit of time and be patient. I've cut the video here once. Tap on it and get all the air out. Now push the damping rod about 3/4 of the way in. We've got way too much fluid. Push in the base valve like that, and applying pressure, it'll push out that damping rod. But as you can see, it's still sticking up and out. I can't get it in. Now, with a lot of pressure, push down and bleed it out. I go about 3/4 of the way in. A lot of fluid is coming out there. I'm pushing really hard here, and then that gets it started, and then you can take your fork cap inner tool and start to tighten it up all the way. Once you've tightened it up all the way, you can snug it up again with your outer tool and your inner tool to make sure that it's the right tension and the right amount of tightness. We've got it snugged up here. Lastly, put your hands over the 2 bleed holes. It'll make a mess if you don't, and collapse it all the way. This bleeds any excess fluid out and any excess air that you may have continued to trap. In our case, there was no air, just fluid. All right, guys, now it's time to put everything together. All your hard work's about to pay off. We've got our already assembled outer tubes and the spring there. Now we're putting our cartridge into it. Carefully do it, put it down, and then screw a couple threads on at the top. Carefully holding it. We hold both sides here so you don't drop it apart. Now you can push down, put that damper holding tool in there. Don't forget your rebound rod. Put it in there. I always like to push on it and make sure that the spring's functioning in there. Then I like to grease my lower base nut. I turn the rebound adjuster all the way out. This is important for assembly. And then I use my assembly grease. I put it on the threads all the way around. This is to prevent any galling between the aluminum base nut and the aluminum lower fork lug. You don't have to do this. It's not specified, but I personally prefer doing it. Thread it on there all the way until it bottoms. Remember, you had to turn your rebound adjuster all the way out. Once it's bottomed, you can then tighten up the jam nut to this. The way I do it is just hold the jam nut and tighten up on the top. This will bring them together, and then you can snug it up. There's a torque spec for this. It's around 20 Newton meters, but do not over tighten this. If you do, you can strip it out and it'll be out a lot of money. These parts are hard to come by, guys. Now we can put everything final back together. We're going to tighten up this base nut, and from there, we can put fluid in the fork. This takes a little while. Take your time. And by the way, there's an O-ring on there, and on some forks, there's a copper crush washer. Don't lose that washer. Now that everything's together, again, you can set your rebound adjuster. This particular one, we're setting at 12. You turn it all the way in until it lightly bottoms, and then back it out the amount of clicks you're desired. And guess what? You're in the home stretch. Time to put some fluid in it. Yeah, you have to have an accurate measurement device here. You can buy these online. Be sure to get a good one. A ratio right can work, but it's really not quite as accurate as you'd like it to be. In this particular fork, we're going with 340 cc's of Maxima 5 weight. And just like that, we're almost done. Tighten up the fork cap all the way you can by hand, put it in whatever your clamping method is, and then I use the inner cap tool to final snug it up. Why? Well, maybe the inner cap we forgot to tighten. Then I take the outer cap tool and I double check it. Hey, you don't need gorilla arms here. It doesn't need to be crazy tight, all right, Hercules? Give it the old-fashioned push test. Yep, we all love the push test. Moving on, set your clicker. Sometimes you can forget, but go ahead and set it now while you get a chance. All the way in till it lightly bottoms, back it out your clicks. And then guess what? You get to do one last push test before you put it on the bike. Hey, if you liked this video, be sure you hit the subscribe button and make sure you smash the like button. It really helps us out and lets us put out more content just like this.